The snow didn't feel like a soft white blanket tonight. To 15-year-old Sarah, it felt like a heavy, cold shroud settling over her thin shoulders as she trudged through the biting wind. In her hand, she clutched an empty cloth sack, so light it could blow away in a gust, yet to Sarah, it felt like the heaviest burden in the world. As the grand clocks in the distant town center began to chime, announcing the final hours of the year, Sarah whispered a question into the dark. "Lord, are you still there, or have you forgotten our little house behind the hill?" Every step she took through the deep drifts felt like a struggle against the world itself. Her old boots, handed down twice before they reached her, had holes in the soles. The frozen slush seeped in, numbing her toes until she could no longer feel them. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, in the drafty wooden shack they called home, her mother was lying under 3 threadbare blankets. The sound of her mother's cough, a hollow, dry rattle, was a ghost that haunted Sarah's dreams. It was a sound that had grown louder as the pantry grew emptier. Sarah's mind drifted back to the scene she had left just 20 minutes ago. Her 2 little brothers, Leo and Toby, were sitting on the floor by the cold fireplace. They were trying to be brave. They were using old, yellowed newspapers to cut out paper snowflakes to decorate the room. "Is the magic dinner coming tonight, Sarah?" Leo had asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. "It's New Year's Eve. Mama said God sends miracles on New Year's Eve." Sarah had forced a smile, though her heart felt like it was being squeezed by an icy hand. "The dinner is coming, Leo. I'm going to go get the flour right now. We'll have hot bread and maybe something sweet." She had walked out into the storm before they could see the tears welling in her eyes. Flour, bread, magic. She had nothing but an empty sack and a prayer that felt like it was hitting a ceiling of lead. For months, she had knelt by her bed every single night. She hadn't asked for gold. She hadn't asked for a fancy dress or a warm coat. She had only asked for her mother's breath to come easier. She had only asked for a small loaf of bread for her brothers. But heaven had remained silent. The winter had only grown harsher, and the fever in the house had only burned hotter. As she climbed the steep path toward the neighbor's house, Sarah looked down at the town in the valley. It was a sea of golden lights. She could almost smell the roasting turkeys and the cinnamon cakes from here. Music drifted up on the wind, happy songs of celebration. How strange, she thought, that the same God who gives them so much leaves us with so little. Is my voice too quiet to be heard? Or is our house too small to be seen from the stars? The wind let out a mournful howl, tossing a spray of ice against her face. She pulled her thin shawl tighter. She was heading to Mrs. Green's house. Mrs. Green was a widow who lived a mile away. She didn't have much herself, but she was the only one who hadn't turned them away last time. "Just a bit of flour," Sarah whispered, her teeth chattering. "Just enough to make 1 loaf. Please, Lord, let her have some to spare. Don't let me go back to those hungry eyes with nothing." Up ahead, a small, warm light flickered in a window. It was Mrs. Green's cottage. It looked like a tiny sanctuary in a world of shadows. Sarah took a deep breath, her lungs stinging from the frost, and pushed herself forward. She didn't know that tonight her faith was about to be tested until it reached its breaking point, and that the silence of heaven was about to be broken in a way she never imagined. Sarah stood before the heavy oak door of the cottage, her hand trembling so violently she had to hold her wrist with the other hand. Inside, she could hear the faint, cheerful crackle of a fireplace, The warmth radiated through the cracks in the wood, mocking her frozen skin. She hesitated. Mrs. Green was known to be a hard woman, a widow who had had many bitter winters alone. People said she counted every grain of salt and never wasted a word. "What if she says no?" Sarah whispered, her breath hitching. "What if she tells me she has nothing to spare?" She almost turned away, but the image of Leo's hopeful eyes and her mother's pale face gave her a sudden, desperate strength. She knocked. It was a soft, timid sound, easily lost in the wind. She knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open. There stood Mrs. Green, wrapped in a thick, dark wool sweater, holding a flickering candle. Her face was like a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes sharp and narrow under gray, bushy brows. "Who is it?" she barked, her voice raspy. "Who's out there disturbing a body on a night like this?" It's Sarah, ma'am," Sarah stammered, looking down at her boots. "From the hill. I'm sorry to bother you so late." Mrs. Green looked Sarah up and down. She saw the thin shawl, the blue tint of the girl's lips, and the empty sack clutched in her hand. Her stern expression didn't change, but she stepped aside. "Don't just stand there letting the frost in," Mrs. Green muttered. "Get inside. Move." The cottage was small and cramped, filled with the scent of dried herbs and old wood. It wasn't the house of a rich person. There were patches on the rug, and the furniture was ancient, but it was warm. "Sit by the fire," Mrs. Green commanded, pointing to a small wooden stool. She went to the stove and poured a cup of hot water with a slice of dried lemon. "Drink this. You're a block of ice." As Sarah sipped the water, her hands finally began to thaw. Mrs. Green sat opposite her, leaning on a cane. "How is your mother?" the old woman asked abruptly. "I haven't seen her at the market in a month." Sarah's voice broke. She's very weak, ma'am. The fever won't leave her, and the cough, it's getting worse." Mrs. Green looked into the fire, her eyes softening for a fleeting second. "It's a cruel winter for the lungs." "And the boys? Are they eating?" Sarah looked at the empty sack on her lap. "That's why I'm here. We ran out of flour 2 days ago. I didn't know where else to go. I don't have any money to give you now, but I can work. I can chop your wood. I can clear your path. I'll do anything if you can just spare a little." Mrs. Green stood up without a word. She walked to her pantry. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard the sound of a ceramic lid being lifted. Mrs. Green looked at her own flour jar. It was less than half full. She lived on a tiny pension, and the next delivery wasn't for weeks. She looked at the jar, then at the shivering girl by her fire. With a heavy sigh, she tilted the jar, pouring a generous amount into Sarah's sack. Then she reached into a small tin box on the top shelf. She pulled out 5 small, brightly wrapped peppermint candies, the only treats she had bought for herself for the entire season. She dropped them into the sack on top of the flour. "Take it," Mrs. Green said, walking back and handing the sack to Sarah. It was no longer light. It had weight now. "It's enough for a few loaves, and tell those brothers of yours to stay away from the drafts." Sarah stood up, tears finally spilling over. "Thank you, Mrs. Green. You don't know what this means. God bless you." Mrs. Green waved her hand dismissively, though her eyes weren't as sharp as before. Yes, just get home safe. The wind is picking up, and the shadows are getting long." As Sarah stepped back out into the cold, the sack felt like a treasure. She didn't feel the wind as much now. She had hope. She had a gift for her brothers. She began the long walk back, unaware that the real shadows were waiting for her just around the bend of the road. The walk back felt shorter. Sarah barely noticed the holes in her boots or the way the wind tried to steal her breath. Every time the sack bumped against her leg, she felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. "Leo will have his peppermint," she whispered, a small, genuine smile finally touching her face. "And Toby will eat until his belly is blonde and full. We'll make the biggest loaf Mother has ever seen." She could already imagine the smell of the baking bread filling their cold shack, turning it into a real home, if only for one night. She felt like a conqueror returning from battle with a great prize. She was only 3 streets away from her hill when the silence of the night was shattered. Laughter, loud, boisterous, and careless laughter echoed from around the corner. A group of 4 or 5 boys, older and stronger than Sarah, burst into the street. They were caught up in the wild energy of the holiday, throwing snowballs and shouting Happy New Year to the empty sky. They weren't looking where they were going. They were just a storm of young, reckless life. Before Sarah could step into the shadows to hide, the tallest boy collided with her. "Whoa, look out, little ghost," he shouted, stumbling. Sarah fell back, clutching the sack to her chest, but another boy reached out and snagged the fabric. "What have you got there, ghost girl? A treasure?" "Please," Sarah gasped, her voice thin and terrified. "It's just flour. Please, give it back." But they weren't listening. To them, she was just an obstacle in their game. The boy tossed the sack to his friend. "Catch, Marcus! It's the championship ball!" "No, stop!" Sarah cried, reaching out, but they were too fast. They began to kick the sack between them, laughing as they ran down the street. It was just a game to them, a piece of cloth filled with dust. But as the sack flew through the air, hit a frozen lamppost, and fell to the ground, a sickening sound filled the air. The worn fabric of the old sack gave way. A cloud of white flour erupted into the night air like a burst of cold steam. It spilled out across the dirty, slushy snow, turning into a gray, useless paste almost instantly. The boy who had kicked it stopped, looking down for a second. "Oops," he muttered, seeing the white powder covering his boots. "The candies," Sarah whispered, falling to her knees. She saw the bright wrappers of Mrs. Green's peppermints sliding into a deep, frozen gutter. She reached for them, her fingers clawing at the ice, but they were gone, swept away by the melting slush of the street. The boys looked at each other. For a moment, a flicker of guilt crossed their faces, but they were young and afraid of being uncool. "Come on, let's go," the leader shouted. "It was just a bag of dust anyway. Happy New Year, girl." They ran off, their laughter fading into the distance, leaving Sarah in a silence that was heavier than any storm. She sat on the frozen ground, her knees soaking up the icy water. She looked at the white stain on the snow. That was their dinner. That was her mother's strength. That was Leo's miracle. She tried to scoop some of the dry flour from the top of the pile, but her trembling hands only mixed it with the dirt and the grit of the road. Her breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps. The cold, which she had ignored just minutes ago, now seemed to sink its teeth into her very bones. She didn't get up. She didn't cry out for help. She just stared at her empty, torn sack. "I tried," she choked out, the words freezing in the air. "I did everything right. I prayed. I worked. I hoped." She looked up at the dark sky, but the stars seemed millions of miles away, cold and indifferent. It was the most beautiful night of the year for everyone else, but for Sarah, it was the moment her world finally went dark. Sarah didn't hear the heavy wooden door creak open. She didn't hear the chime of the brass bell or the crunch of boots on the fresh snow. She was buried in her own silence until a shadow fell over her, a large, steady shadow that blocked the biting wind. "It's a terrible thing to waste good flour," a deep, rumbling voice said. It wasn't a voice of mockery, but of quiet, heavy sadness. Sarah looked up through blurred vision. Standing above her was a tall man with hair as white as the snow and an apron dusted with the very thing she had lost. It was Mr. Harrison, the owner of the town's finest bakery. His face was etched with the lines of many years, and his eyes, though tired, held a flicker of something Sarah hadn't seen all night: understanding. "I saw them," he said softly, gesturing toward the empty street where the boys had vanished. "I saw it all from my window. Come, child, stand up. The cobblestones are no place for a soul to spend New Year's Eve." He reached out a large, calloused hand. Sarah hesitated, but the cold was making her dizzy. She took his hand, and he lifted her as if she weighed no more than a feather. He guided her toward the glowing window of the bakery. As they stepped inside, the chime of the doorbell felt like a high, heavenly note. Sarah gasped. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of yeast, warm sugar, cinnamon, and roasting nuts. It was so warm that the frost on her eyelashes instantly turned to tears that ran down her cheeks. "Sit," Mr. Harrison commanded gently, pointing to a chair near the massive brick oven. The oven glowed like a trapped sun, radiating a heat that began to chase the numbness from Sarah's bones. He didn't ask her questions right away. Instead, he went to a shelf and brought back a thick slice of brioche, still steaming, and a mug of hot milk stirred with honey. "Eat," he said. "The world looks different when your stomach isn't screaming." As Sarah ate, she looked around. The bakery was filled with trays of golden loaves, braided cakes, and jars of colorful preserves. It was a kingdom of abundance. "You have so much," Sarah whispered, her voice finally returning. "You must be the happiest man in the valley." Mr. Harrison stopped his work and looked at the rows of bread. A shadow crossed his face. "I have flour and I have gold, child. But tonight I was going to lock this door and go home to a house with 20 rooms and not a single voice to greet me. I have spent 40 years baking bread for people to take home to their families while I forgot to build one of my own." He looked at Sarah, seeing the torn sack she still gripped in her lap. "I was standing by that window, asking the Lord what the point was of all this work if there is no one to share the harvest with. And then I saw you. I saw you fighting for a sack of dust as if it were the crown jewels." Sarah told him then. She told him about the cold shack, her mother's rattle-thin breath, and Leo's newspaper snowflakes. She told him how she had felt forgotten by God on the very night of miracles. Mr. Harrison listened in total silence. When she finished, he didn't just offer her a new bag of flour. He stood up and began to pull a large wooden crate from under the counter. "Flour is easily replaced, Sarah," he said, his voice growing stronger, more purposeful. "But a prayer is a heavy thing to carry alone. Tonight, I think the Lord decided that my bakery has been full for too long, and your home has been empty for far too long." He began to pile loaves of bread, jars of honey, and tinned meats into the crate. Sarah watched, her heart hammering. "But I can't pay for this, sir," she cried. Mr. Harrison stopped and looked her in the eye. For the first time, he smiled. "You already did, Sarah. You brought a lonely old man a reason to open his heart on New Year's Eve. Now, keep that chair warm. I'm going to hitch the horses to the delivery wagon. We have a hill to climb." The climb back up the hill didn't feel like a struggle this time. Sarah sat on the velvet bench of Mr. Harrison's heavy delivery wagon, wrapped in a thick bearskin rug that smelled of lavender and old books. The wagon's lanterns were like two golden eyes cutting through the swirling blizzard, and the rhythmic clop-clop of the two powerful horses felt like the beating of a hopeful heart. Sarah looked at the massive wooden crate at her feet, overflowing with treasures she had only seen in store windows. She felt a strange mix of joy and trembling awe. Just an hour ago, she had been ready to surrender to the snow. As the wagon pulled up to the lopsided wooden shack, the door creaked open. Leo and Toby stood in the doorway, their small silhouettes framed by the weak, flickering light of a single dying candle. "Sarah?" Leo's voice was small and frightened. "Is that you? We heard a thunder on the road." "It's me, Leo," Sarah cried, jumping from the wagon before it had even fully stopped. "It's not thunder, it's a miracle." Mr. Harrison climbed down, his heavy boots making a solid, reassuring sound in the snow. He didn't say a word as he hoisted the massive crate onto his shoulder and carried it into the small, cold room. When he set it down on the rickety table, it groaned under the weight of the abundance. The boys gasped. Their eyes, usually dull with hunger, sparkled in the lamplight. There were roasted chickens wrapped in foil, jars of golden apricot jam, wheels of creamy cheese, and at the very top, a giant box of hand-dipped chocolates and a sack of fresh peppermints. "Is it for us?" Toby whispered, reaching out to touch a loaf of bread that was still warm. "It is all for you," Mr. Harrison said, his voice deep and warm as a fireplace. "And there is more in the wagon: blankets, coal for the fire, and medicine that will help your mother breathe." Mr. Harrison walked to the mother's bedside. He didn't look at her with pity, but with the respect one gives to a soldier. He handed Sarah a small blue bottle. "This is an elixir from the town's best doctor," he whispered. "It will break the fever by morning." Then he turned back to Sarah, his face grave but kind. "Sarah, a girl who will walk through a blizzard for a handful of flour is a girl who understands the soul of bread. I am getting old and my hands are tired. I need an apprentice in the bakery, someone I can trust to take over when I am gone. Starting next week, you will have a job. You will learn the trade, and your family will never see a cold hearth or an empty pantry again." Sarah fell into her mother's arms, weeping, not from pain, but from the overwhelming weight of God's answer. She remembered her prayer on the street. "Why are you doing this to me?" Now she understood. If the boys hadn't taken her sack, she would have returned home with only enough for one night. She would have made one loaf of bread, and tomorrow they would have been hungry again. God hadn't ignored her prayer. He had allowed her to lose a tiny gift so that he could give her a new life. As Mr. Harrison began to stoke the fire, filling the room with a roar of orange heat, Sarah looked at the newspaper snowflakes Leo had made. They were still pinned to the wall, but they didn't look like symbols of poverty anymore. They looked like the stars she had been looking for all night. "I heard you, Lord," she whispered, her heart finally at peace. The answer wasn't in the flour. The answer was in the light that followed the dark. The echoes of laughter and the crackling of the fire in Sarah's home eventually faded into the quiet peace of the first morning of the year. But the miracle that took place that night didn't end with a warm meal. It was the beginning of a story that would be told in that valley for generations. A story not just about bread, but about the mysterious ways in which light finds its way through the thickest darkness. Sometimes we find ourselves standing exactly where Sarah stood, in the middle of a frozen street, looking at the spilled flour of our own lives. We work hard, we pray with all our might, and we try to be good people. Yet the wind still bites and our sacks still tear. In those moments, it is easy to look at a silent sky and feel forgotten. But as we saw in Sarah's journey, faith is not the belief that God will stop the storm. Faith is the quiet, steady knowing that you are never walking through the storm alone. Sarah thought her prayer was for flour, but the Lord knew her prayer was actually for a future, for healing, and for a father figure for her brothers. To give her the greater gift, he had to let her lose the smaller one. The most beautiful part of this story isn't just that Sarah was saved, it's how she was saved. God didn't drop bread from the clouds. He used the lonely heart of an old baker and the humble sacrifice of a stern widow. Mrs. Green gave her last candies, and Mr. Harrison gave his abundance. Both of them became the answer to a prayer they didn't even hear Sarah whisper. This is the great secret of the world. God often chooses to work through our hands. He uses our eyes to see the suffering of our neighbors, and he uses our feet to trudge through the snow to help them. As we stand on the threshold of this new year, look around you. There are Sarahs everywhere. They aren't always asking for flour. Sometimes they are asking for a kind word, a moment of your time, or a sign that they still matter. Don't wait for a grand miracle to happen. Be the miracle. When you act with selfless love, when you give without expecting anything in return, you are the answer to someone's desperate midnight prayer. You become a beacon of light in a world that can often feel very cold. May your heart be as brave as Sarah's. May your spirit be as generous as Mr. Harrison's. And may you always remember that even when the sky seems silent, there is a grander tapestry being woven, and every thread, even the dark ones, is part of a beautiful design. Thank you for praying and walking through this story with us. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your home with the warmth of his presence this year. Happy New Year, and remember, keep the light burning.